you're escorted to the door with the cardboard box in the hand like we see in the movies. I owned an apartment in New York, so I had a fair high expense level. And he was like, you're out of your mind.
This was you starting your first business, technically speaking. So you essentially become CEO of your own consultancy.
And my pitch was essentially to the clients, I'm going to get you 80% of the way there for 20% of the cost. I wasn't ultimately in charge. And I think as a CEO, and that was the first time I experienced the challenges of being squeezed essentially between what we wanted to do as a team and a board.
Peter, I'm so pleased to have you here for another edition of CEO Stories. Thank you for joining us. I particularly look forward to this interview because you have such a varied and interesting career, and I'm sure it's going to be a great discussion. Where I'd like to start us off with is the very first time when you decided that corporate life wasn't for you and that you wanted to become a CEO. Can you take us back to that time?
Well, thanks for having me, Tom. It's a pleasure to be here today. I was working on Wall Street at an investment bank called UBS, and I freaking hated it. I wasn't happy in the work that I was doing. I was working 14-hour days, 7 days a week. And one day I walk into my boss's office and I say, you know what, I can't do this anymore. I want to do something else. And typically when you leave an investment bank, because of the information that you handle, you're escorted to the door with the cardboard box in the hand like we see in the movies. But my boss was kind and said the 14 days, this was in New York, obviously. And so you only have 2 weeks notice. So he said, the next 2 weeks, why don't you sit down at your desk and figure out what you're going to do? And maybe you'll change your mind. And so he basically took my assignments away from me and let me do that. And as I sat there, I thought about, what do I love to do? Can I find a job doing what I love? And there were 3 things that I loved at the time, and I probably still do. Number 1 was understanding humans, understanding people's behaviors and motivations. Why do we do what we do? So I loved thinking about that and working on that. The second thing was what companies can do. What are the corporate strategies? What are the technologies available to them? How can they develop and do products and services? And the third thing was to kind of tie those 2 things together. So how can I, with my understanding of human development and human behavior and my interest and understanding of how companies and technologies are going to evolve over time, build new things? So that was what I came up with as a 28-year-old, right? And I said to him, I figured out what I want to do. I want to go be a consultant and help companies develop products and services. And at the time, mind you, I was making a very nice living. I owned an apartment in New York, so I had a fair high expense level. And he was like, you're out of your mind, but go do it. I did. I had my first pitch on a Tuesday. I had my first client on a Friday, and I was off to the races. Yeah.
This was you starting your first business, technically speaking. So you essentially become CEO of your own consultancy. What was the first sort of business about? What did you do for that first client?
It was a consultancy. So the way I typically describe it is we helped our clients understand the information that they had about their current and potential future customers, so their market research information, understand their competitors, so what are the companies they're competing with doing, and tying that together and give them recommendations on what their corporate strategy should be. So it was a consultancy. Our competitors at the time were the likes of BCG and McKinsey and sort of Deloitte and other big consultancies. And my pitch was essentially to the clients, I'm going to get you 80% of the way there for 20% of the cost. And once I've done my work, you can then take it to one of the big brands, have them essentially verify it, and then go to the board with it. And that turned out to be a quite easy business to do.
I was going to ask you this question, but it sounds to me like you had a relatively easy start for finding your first client. Did you feel nervous running your own business, starting out on your own? You obviously weren't happy what you were doing. going into that, did it ever feel to you like you're taking a huge risk, or did you feel like actually this seems to come pretty naturally?
I think I had the benefit of youth. I didn't know any better, right? At the time, I didn't have children. Uh, I had a girlfriend, and so, but I didn't have big responsibilities in that way. So I actually didn't feel nervous. I didn't think about it. Living in the United States. So I live in Denmark now, and the attitude there was different. It's like, of course you can go do that, even though you don't have a social security net, you don't have anything like that, right? So I didn't feel nervous at the time. And you're right, it did feel easy, but of course that was just the beginning. I did have my challenges also in that business.
You eventually led multiple other companies. If I'm not mistaken, you've been CEO 6 times, if I've got that right. What was the thing that pushed you away from doing that kind of consulting? What made you go, actually, you know what, I need something more than this?
So two things. One was I ended up selling the business, and as I sold it, I had an earnout where I became an executive in the acquiring company. But the other thing that happened while I was having the first company is I got to meet people who wanted to start their own business. And so I have always been like, of course you can do that. Let me help you. Let us figure this thing out. And because of that, out of that came opportunities where people were like, could you actually run this thing for us? Because I don't really know how to run a business. I'm a product person, right? Or I don't really know how to sell. I like to be at home on the farm doing this thing. So that's how I ended up in those roles over the years. It was more an accident than something by design.
So you've now transitioned to being another CEO at a different business. Um, in the new business, was it as plain sailing as the first time, or did you suddenly find you running into new challenges?
The second time around was a much bigger animal. So essentially, I was just a CEO of a division, if you will, or a group.
How many people, Peter?
So in the company was 3,500 people, and the area I was responsible for was 75 or 85, something like that. So in that sense, it was a big business compared to where I came from because we were just 10 in my own. But I think what made it challenging was I wasn't ultimately in charge. And I think as a CEO, we always have or oftentimes have a board and sometimes have investors and other things that we have to deal with. And that was the first time I experienced the challenges of being squeezed essentially between what we wanted to do as a team and a board and a group of investors. And so I learned that lesson in my early 30s, mid 30s, how to navigate that.
Right now, you are a personal coach to other CEOs. If you could go back now to you at that age, were you about 30-ish, I suppose, at that age? 34. So if you can go back to the 34-year-old version of yourself and say, this is what's going to happen, what advice would you give yourself for how to manage that?
I would start with not taking things as personally as I did. So I felt it was very personal when somebody challenged the way we were doing things or asking me to do certain things. The second thing is be aware of the agenda that people have, right? So everybody who gives you advice is coming at it from a different perspective. But when you're in that situation, they all have an agenda. And I think I was a little naive to that, right? Um, and thirdly, uh, make sure that you don't work all the time. And I think it was I didn't learn the lesson then. That came many years later. But I was working constantly, and that made me a less effective CEO. And certainly on a personal level, gave me some significant challenges over the years. So I would advise a 34-year-old CEO to relax a little bit, essentially.
Right, right. But would you also say you took some positives from that time? Was there anything that you would say you learned that was, because naturally being in a smaller one and then going to a bigger business, there's new lessons to learn. What was your most positive takeaway from that?
So the most positive takeaway from being in a bigger business was the impact you could have if you knew how to delegate effectively. So in a smaller business, yes, you delegate, but it was a little bit like, oh, I could just do it if we needed to do it. In a bigger business, you have to rely on and understand the strength of your executive team and delegate basically everything to those people. And I learned that early on, and I think that was a huge benefit from being in that environment.
But eventually you did decide to move on and you then took on a new challenge.
Mhm.
Can you, maybe rather than describing the new role, what was the day that you decided enough's enough, actually? Did anything happen, or was it more opportunity that came your way?
No, I essentially got fired. So I've tried that twice in over the years. So I was leading this business. They had relocated me from the United States to London, UK, because they wanted to build a global footprint in a different way. 6 months after I got to the UK, they say we're shutting down this group that you're heading up, and we're letting you go. And so I didn't make the choice, but in hindsight, I was happy that it happened. Um, so now I'm sitting in London. I don't have my job. I didn't really worry about my identity as a CEO. But then there was a startup that was had been going for a bit, that was funded by some people that I knew, that was in trouble. And so they asked me, "Hey, could you take over and see if you can pivot this business as our new CEO?" And I said yes, and we ended up doing that for 3 years or so.
In real life, it doesn't happen as quickly as that, right? So you have some time to think about and to muse about your next steps. We in that time thinking, I'd love to do something more startup like, or was it just coincidental?
No, I definitely was. I wasn't applying for regular jobs. I typically say when I'm asked this question that I'm not really good at being an employee anymore. And I think back then that was what I realized. Being in that big machine in that way, I enjoyed being ultimately in charge. I enjoy that I can make decisions more or less unilaterally. Um, and so I was looking for something where I could do that. And that naturally would either be me starting my own thing again or me getting into a situation where I had complete latitude.
This new startup that called you, what was the name of this startup?
They were called somewhere.com. Yeah, they've since sold the domain to somebody else, but because the business is no longer. But essentially, it was a recruitment platform that focused on cultural fit. So the idea that we hire people that fit our culture rather than we hire people that have the right CV. Um, and they had been doing a B2C business for years and they hadn't made it work. And I pivoted into a B2B business and had corporates as clients rather than individuals.
And the interesting point for me about that is when you make that strategic decision to pivot the business, how do you come to the idea and how do you trust your gut that this is going to be what changes their business or turn it around?
I looked at I followed the money essentially, right? I said, who will value what we do the most? When you look at, so we had American Express as a customer. American Express has, at the time, had like 30,000 employees globally. They get 275,000 resumes a year through their ATS, their applicant tracking system. 275,000, and they hire around 3,000 people at the time. So I said, if I can help them reduce the time it takes to go through all these resumes, even if technology does a bunch of it, if I can reduce the amount of time they need to spend interviewing, and if I can guarantee that the person they hire fits the culture of the marketing team or the operational team or whatever it is, then they can save a bunch of time and a bunch of money. And so I went to them and I said, let me look at the data that you have on your current employees. This was before GDPR, but you could still do it today. Um, and let me match the fit of the culture. Because at the end of the day, Tom, this could be a long conversation, but at the end of the day, we all know that when we interview, we end up sitting down in front of, let's say, 3 or 5 people that we're considering for a role. and they're all qualified on paper. But what ends up happening is you end up hiring Susan because there's something about Susan that just you say she will fit, right? And so our claim to fame was we can figure that out before Susan gets into the chair. So rather than having a funnel that looks like this, we told American Express, we'll make it look like this. We'll give you 20 candidates for each job that culturally will fit. They, of course, have the qualifications. And you just need to decide out of those 20, who do you want to speak to first? So we saved them 60% of the time and probably 90% of the cost in the hiring process. And that became the business.
Yeah. A bit of a random question, but I remember I used to work with Accenture, and I remember they did a lot of tests, so personality tests, and you got quite a great breakdown of your personality. I find it quite accurate usually. And I was curious, could you use this to determine what would make a great team? And should you use this, especially as a consultancy, where you can say, can we balance? Great teams typically have these combinations of personalities, more or less, without being too scientific about it, and to recognize imbalanced teams. But generally speaking, the feedback was, we can't do that. It's not allowed. It's discrimination. I'm curious about your opinion about that, having been in this kind of company, whether you think that's it could have a good or negative effect if you did that.
Well, so if I understand your point right correctly on discrimination, so discrimination is if we pick somebody based on age, gender, or political belief, right? But we are discriminating essentially when we're hiring because I'm like, I can see myself working with Tom because I like the guy, but I can't see myself working with Ben. That's also discrimination, right? So to answer your question differently, the technology we had could help them understand whether or not this person would fit into the existing structure. It didn't necessarily tell them whether or not their personality would be one that they could develop or do these things with. So they would do other tests that are much more established than what we did. Um, could you use what we did to do that? Maybe, but we never got that far. Um, and I think, as a side note, in one of my subsequent companies, actually here in Denmark, as I started that, I asked the investors and the owners, I said, I'd like to do intelligence testing of candidates. And they're like, what now? We can't do that. I'm like, why can't I give them a Raven standardized intelligence test? Oh, because that's not allowed. I'm like, really? Is it not allowed? Or does it just make you uncomfortable? Because I had this firm belief that core logical intelligence was a driver for the intellectual curiosity that we needed in the people in that business. And so it turns out you can actually test for intelligence. There's no law against that. But maybe candidates would find it off-putting. And so I wrestled with it, and eventually we decided not to do it.
I think some consultancies do it. I've seen some, it's not technically an IQ test, but it's very similar, and they make you go through a couple of tests prior to even going to an interview. So I don't think there's an indirect way, I guess, of doing it where it doesn't feel like one, but it is still one. I want to fast forward to a company that really fascinated me in your resume, which was Hollow, and quite advanced in terms of the technology that you were using there. Do you mind just telling me at least your opinion from the inside and what Hollow was like?
So Hollow, for those listening and watching this potentially, was a company that, or is a company that operates self-driving vehicles. And it started by a group of people investing in a company that produced some of these vehicles and wanting to put fleets on the ground to rid cities of cars, essentially, right? And we can get into all that if you want. But it was a technology-driven company, very much at the leading edge of where this technology was and still is. So I joined in October 2016 as the CEO and first person, and ended up hiring a team, 60 something people in 5 countries eventually. Hollow is a great idea. The technology today exists that allows us to drive without a driver from point A to point B. Just go to San Francisco, you can experience it. Arizona, Miami, Chicago, all sorts of cities already, Los Angeles. The challenge that business has is not consumer adoption. People sit in Teslas and other cars that can drive by themselves these days. The challenge that business has is politicians' willingness to allow you to operate these vehicles on the streets. Um, so that's the those were the challenges with that business.
And those early startup days when you hired this team, um, it obviously sounds like it grew quite well. You must have had some investment to keep you going. Was it? Tell me about the exciting part of that initial journey.
Picking the team. So I loved that group of people. We did the interview process differently than I had done before. We ended up hiring anything from military personnel to lawyers to entrepreneurs in different roles. That we didn't hire the lawyer to be a lawyer. That person ended up doing something else for us. But we really focused on getting the right team together.
And do you think that was a little bit from your somewhere.com the experience that?
Definitely, and now I'm the guest on your show here. But if you ask any of the people who worked in that business, I'm pretty sure the vast majority of them will say this was the best place I've worked so far in my career because of the culture that we managed to create. It was just an amazing group of people doing something quite remarkable. You have to remember, it never been done. It was new technology. It was a new go-to-market. It was a new use case. It was a new investment scenario. Everything was new regulatory environment. And so you had to have a group of people who were more than just explorers and adventurers. They had to have the stamina for us to be essentially knocked down left and right. They had to have the inventiveness to put together mechanical solutions and put antennas on roofs to make stuff work. Um, so it was really a remarkable group of people we got together.
What did you do right about the hiring? How did you manage to put that group together and build that? Because I guess it's not just the right people. You've got to put a bit of a platform in place for them to thrive. What do you think were some of the right things you did?
So I think it starts with attracting them, right? So, and that's how you write job descriptions, because we still did those, and how you kind of talk about it in the public domain. You know, I've been very active on LinkedIn for a number of years now, and because I talk about all my ideas, I started talking about this stuff, and so people started coming to me, right? Then you need to be able to identify who actually got it and who didn't have it, because a lot of people want to work in startups. A ton of people think that that's what they want to do. And I appreciate that. But the reality is, the vast majority of them should never be near a startup. And that's why a lot of startups fail, because they hire the wrong people. So I spend an insane amount of time getting to know the people who were interested in working with us, meeting with them personally, physically, calling them at odd hours, talking to them, really understanding who they were. So the thing I now advise people on is, you need to, as a CEO, you need to spend at least 50% of your time, at least, on your people. And you need to be involved in all the stages of hiring when you're a small company. As you grow bigger, that becomes very difficult. But I spoke to all of these 65, 70 people multiple times for multiple hours in the interview process. And then the last point I wanted to share here, Tom, is if it doesn't feel right, don't hire them. I've stopped the hire in the 13th hour because I just had a feeling like this is not going to be great. And my team was frustrated because they were overworked. They really needed this person, it screwed up plans, whatever. I'm like, it ain't right. I can't say exactly why, but we're not going to hire this person. And so, of course, we got it wrong a couple of times too. But the thing is, there is no more important decision as a CEO, as a startup person, than who you hire. And the vast majority of people, they spend too little time and they hire too fast. And then they need to deal with the headache when they need to get rid of people, which they take too long to do. And their companies suffer from it. So I cannot underline this enough. Hiring is the number one issue.
Yeah, I recently listened to Stephen Bartlett at a conference, and he almost 200% agreed with what you just said, where he said he looks at a CEO's calendar, and if it's not filled with recruiting tasks, then he knows it's not going that well in the company, or at least that they're not focused on the right tasks. So even before his speech, he was busy looking at recruiting just before he came on stage.
And it's not just recruiting, right? It's also developing your people, because that would be the next thing that I didn't answer. But once people are in the boat, and we can talk about how we set salaries and how we motivate them afterwards. But the second most important thing is make sure you understand where your people are mentally, where they are physically, what they need to be doing. Understand. So I have a client now. I advised her to spend more time understanding her team's families and the dynamics, and she's like, why do I need to do that? Because it affects who shows up at work. So it's a full-time job to be a manager of others, and a lot of people treat it as a part-time thing, which is why they don't succeed.
I know reading Henry Ford's book, he was talking about, he probably got a little bit too personal, but he wanted to know, everything about the families, and he in a level of detail, or he actually wanted to change some of family circumstances of some of his employees where some felt it was a bit too close. But I think he understood the principle of a happy workforce, and I believe he paid his workforce really well as well at the time. So he understood how that drives all productivity. And speaking then of productivity, and I guess the hard work that came with it and the demands, I think you know where I'm heading. And there became too demanding for you eventually to lead Hollow. Talk to me about that stage of burnout. So you burned out eventually after, I think it was about 3 years leading this business. How did you know you're burnt out? How did that sort of feel?
Yeah, the brief version is I didn't know. I woke up one morning and I couldn't physically move. And I was at an age, I'm 50, I turned 51 this year. So back then I was 45. And so I thought, shit, sorry, I swore. I thought, darn it. Do I have a brain tumor? Is something wrong? Because I literally, my arms and legs, I couldn't get out of bed.
Physically couldn't move.
Physically couldn't move. And so I somehow managed to call my sister, and because I was in an apartment by myself. I was in the process of getting divorced, so we were separated. So there was a lot of personal things happening at the time. So I called my sister. My sister happens to be a psychologist who is an expert on mindfulness-based strategies for stress reduction. And that's fortuitous because I called her and she showed up later. I don't remember what I said. She's later told me that I wasn't coherent. And this is like 7:30 in the morning, right? She shows up. I get some help with psychologist. I end up getting out of bed, and we can talk about then what happened. But I had no clue it was happening to me. In hindsight, I do remember telling my board members on occasion when they asked me, because we were moving quite fast, we were spending a lot of money, and we're having all these challenges, right? And they say, "So, Peter, how are you doing?" And I sometimes use this phrase. I said, "I'm doing okay, but it does feel like I'm the captain of a fighter jet in a dog fight." So fighter jet going against each other. But I'm hanging on the wing and looking into the cockpit where I should be sitting, and there's nobody there. So I used that image, and none of my board members were like, "Wait a minute, that doesn't sound right. Maybe we should get Peter some help, or maybe he needs to take a break, or maybe we need to understand what's happening there." But that's the only thing I can remember that I expressed. Other than that, and I wrote about this literally today on LinkedIn, I was walking around with everything myself. I didn't share anything about my personal life struggles, about my professional challenges, about my anything. I was only with it with myself, and that's what led me to burnout. It wasn't the last company. It was the last 15 years of running that way that caused me to end up that morning and not being able to move.
Is there anything you could have done even though this had been a build up over 15 years, is there anything you could have done during that 3 years at Hollow that would have changed or turned it around in your mind before the burnout happened?
Yes, there's a couple of things, I think. One, my mind was always on work. It had always been. So I wasn't necessarily working a lot of physical hours, but I wasn't thinking about anything else but that. So what I could have done is taken the advice again of my my sister, who years before said, I think you should start thinking about meditation and trying that to try and calm what's happening in your mind. And I rejected that. If I'd done that, I think I would have ended up in a better situation. Number two, have a better work life balance. So my partner at the time often said, you're home, but you're not here. And which is also what I teach now, right? I was not present with my loved ones. And number three was the environment I was in was quite challenging. So my board consisted of executives from a holding company that my investors also owned, a holding company that was asked to cut people and expenditures in their businesses, while at the same time I was given multitudes of millions of euros to invest in some pipe future dream, essentially. And so my board was working counter to what the business needed. And I didn't see that because I was so busy executing. And so the politics of that setup was really bad for me. I didn't realize that. And that is something I should have changed.
Well, um, I'm thinking then about that time when you decided you took a break. You said, okay, you need I mean, physically, it sounded like you had to take a break. Um, and now you had some time to think about, whether you want to continue working, whether you want to still be the CEO. And one day you make the decision, no, I'm not going back. And tell me about that day and what makes you make that decision.
So this is the second time I got fired because while I was sick, so I was out on sick leave for 6 weeks, I come back to work. I still can't see what's happening in the screen in front of me. I was looking at my calendar and it looked like Greek lettering, right? So I had no idea what was going on. So back on sick leave, another 6 weeks. So now I've been out for 13 weeks in total. And the head of HR at the holding company, who was essentially acting on the behalf of the chairman, calls me and said, we need to have that conversation. And they let me go. So they fired me while I was sick. And when you're a CEO and have a CEO contract, they can do that, right? It's not like a regular employee. Yeah. They can do that. They can let you go, which is fine. And they treated me in accordance with my contract, which means I got a year of salary and some benefits and some other things. And I still owned shares in the company. So they did what they were supposed to do legally. On a human level, we could discuss whether or not they should have done it, but that's how they did it. And I'm a big boy, so I understand that they did that. Um, so I sat there, and then I had a little bit of an existential crisis, right? Because I was like, okay, I've been a CEO for the last 12 years and a founder, and my identity is so tied up in what I do and the people that I work with, and this team that I described to you. I was leaving behind. I felt like I was, you know, leaving them adrift without me, and what are they going to do and what's happening. And so it took me a couple of months to get over that. Again, through the help of some professionals, I started changing my lifestyle in terms of when I get up and what I do and how I eat and exercise and sleep and all sorts of things. So I started learning what actually is required to perform at the level that I was performing at. And then I started thinking about, okay, what am I going to do now? I still need to work. I'm not a wealthy man, so I've had some success, but not like I could stop working, and I kind of wanted to. Um, and I had two options, Tom, to answer your question. I could either go back and start a new company or become the CEO of a company because that's the only thing I know how to and I want to, or I could do something else. And I started thinking about what that something else could be. I've always written a lot, so I actually wrote a novel back then. It's not published yet, but I started writing. I started writing some business book ideas. But then I realized that I had gotten to the point that I had gotten to because nobody along the way had been able to talk to me and help me in a way that was helpful. I talked to psychologists, I talked to mentors, I'd had advisors, I'd had board members, I'd had investors, co founders, even, but nobody really understood what it meant to be me. And everybody had this agenda that I mentioned earlier. So I thought, what if I could help other founder CEOs have a better experience being founder CEOs than I've had? And through that, helping them, I could help all the people in their companies. I could have a massive impact that way. And so then this is how I ended up here. I wrote 40 or so founder CEOs around the world, people who don't know me from before. I found them on LinkedIn. I wrote them cold. I said, I have this idea. I want to understand whether it exists somewhere in the world to see if I can understand how it's done, because I'd never done this. A bunch of them replied quickly, that sounds amazing. I have not experienced that. How much would it be to work with you, and how do we get started? So I was like, wait a minute, there is something here. And then I didn't do something about it for a couple of months because I was just trying to figure stuff out. I one day get a phone call from somebody in the United States, not a person that I'd written, somebody who's fairly well known in Texas, an entrepreneur there. He was facing some issues. He said, I heard from so and so that you're thinking about doing this. I really need somebody who has no stake in any of the stuff that I'm doing. Would you be able to come and spend some time with me and talk to me about some of these decisions that I have to make? And so I flew to Austin, Texas, spent the weekend. He became my client, and since then I've worked with north of 50 people at this point, I think, in 13 different countries.
Oh, wow. And in a sense, you're like a mental coach, I guess, for CEOs? Or do you think there's more to it than the mental side of it? Do you think it's on practical strategies as well? How would you describe it?
Yeah, so I designed this thing called the whole human approach to be my thing, which is, which basically says there is no work-life balance. There's only work-life integration. And within that, there are things that happen in our professional life and things that happen in our personal life. And then there are tactics, like how do I run a meeting? And then there are strategies, which is what kind of company do I want to build, as an example. And so when I meet a client for the first time, and people come to me now fairly regularly, I try to understand, what is the problem here? What is it that you need to get help with? And so most people come to me and think they have a business problem. Oh, I don't know how to scale my finance operation, or I need to consider going into Belgium or into France as the next country or whatever. But in the vast majority of the cases, it's not a business problem. In the vast majority of cases, it's a personal problem. It's a problem of, I have imposter syndrome, or I'm a little bit of a jerk. I want to change that because my people are starting to not following me, or I need to do something different so that my relationship works at home, or it turns out to be a personal problem. And so my business is not really one that you can put on a formula. I speak to folks. Most of my clients I speak to every single week. And we start with whatever is the number one issue that we need to fix. And then we kind of work our way through. And eventually, and in most cases, after 6 weeks or so, that's the average, people are happier, healthier, more positive than when we started. So that's amazing. And then we spend the next 6 to 8 weeks making sure that that sticks and they have new ways of doing things. So it's typically a 3-month process from them being in a not good state to being where they want to be.
Are there any of these cases that you worked on where you felt, man, that was amazing, or this sort of you could see visually almost what the transformation is of that business or that person?
All of them. It's really is my life work, and I don't know if the video is going to be used, but I'm smiling now. I'm laughing. I mean, it makes me tremendously happy that I get to do this. I almost get teary eyes. I sat with one a few weeks ago, and he's like, "It's amazing. I did not believe this could happen. I did not believe you could do this, but here we are 4 weeks later, and I have time on my hands, and I'm happy again, and I look forward to going to the office." And I'm like, I cannot believe you could do that, Peter. I'm like, well, I didn't necessarily believe I could do it either, but it just shows you the power of, as a CEO, having somebody with whom you can talk about your innermost fears and concerns, and be open and vulnerable with. And I think people are that with me, Tom, because I am open and vulnerable. I tell everybody my stuff and what happened and how I dealt with it. And I understand the pressure that they're under when you've raised $15 million, and you have 100 people working for you and shit's not working, right? I understand that. So they have a different dialogue with me than they have with other people, which means they have different results with me than they have with other people. And so
But there's
that's,
also, I guess, there's
yeah.
also a level of empathy that needs to go with it. So you need to really enjoy the human psychology. And I think that's something you said where when you were back in that first role and you enjoyed, sort of running a company, but also how people work. So I guess it's the care that goes with it about their success that matters as much as having been there before.
Absolutely. The thing that matters most to me is that they get better. I typically tell my clients, uh, I don't really care about your business. I don't really care whether or not you're going to be successful. I don't really care about your board. I actually don't care about your investors at all. The only thing I care about is you. So, what do you need to do with me to get to the place that you want to be? And in some cases, mind you, Tom, some of these folks that come to me, they're in such a bad shape that they're like, I just want to give up on everything. And so I'm like, all right, that's fine. If that's where we're going to end up, that's where we're going to end up. But let's figure out what we can manage or control or work our way through. Nothing is worth sacrificing your personal health and well being over. Trust me, nothing is. But they are getting to a place where they are sacrificing all that because they feel a responsibility towards employees or to investors and stuff. And so, most of the cases so far, knock on wood, we've gotten to a place where they can live the life they want to live, lead the businesses that they want to lead. And then, yes, businesses have challenges, and some businesses are not going to survive. And some of my clients' businesses probably won't survive. But that's the nature of startups. As long as it doesn't take them down with it, that's what we're trying to avoid.
This whole human approach, um, the concept is clear, so integrated life and work. But what are some of the fundamentals that you look for when you speak to one of these CEOs? What do you want to see to know they've got it right?
I want them to live their values. So one of the things I asked them about is, what are your values? And most people actually don't know what their values are. Or they say platitudes like, oh, I want to be an ethical human being. I'm like, all right, what does that mean? So I want them to see that they're living their values. Because if they're living their values, I know there's not a disconnect between who they are at their core and how they go out into the world. So most people will say, actually, I love my kids more than anything in the world. I'd do anything for them. All right. But you're showing me in your calendar and the way that you prioritize your time that a lot of other things come before your kids, right? So that might be okay for a while if you make that choice, but you just need to be aware that what you're saying is not what you're doing. Are we okay with that? Right?
Why do people do that?
Well, they
What
do
do,
that.
I do that too,
Yeah.
so I'm asking for me too.
Yeah. Well, they do that because we have work will take up all the space that we give it and then some. And it's because we have, as professional human beings, certainly a lot of us who are white collar workers or knowledge workers, right? We can work at all times. So we're not good at setting boundaries. There's a societal thing where if I say to people, I actually don't answer emails after 6 o'clock at night, it has to be mandated by law, like I think it is in Germany or France, for people to actually do it. That's crazy. But we also do it because actually, Tom, A lot of us are really good at this thing called work. I can sit down at my computer, I can write emails, I can, sell stuff, I can buy stuff, I can build stuff. But a lot of us are not very good at this emotional connection to our kids or to our partner. Certainly men. I have a lot of male clients. I also have female clients, but a lot of the male clients I have, they want to be good dads. They want to be great husbands and partners. They just don't know how. And so a lot of I actually sometimes say I'm equal parts marriage counselor as I am business coach. I claim to have been part of saving 3 marriages at this point. And the answer is quite simple. Spend more time with your spouse. Spend more time with your kids. But I can't. I have all these other things. I'm like, really? You cannot have at least a weekly date night with your wife? Why not? Well, because I have to talk to investors in the United States. I'm like, every Tuesday? You don't, right? So I think I'm just calling people out on the choices that they're making. And then they start making different choices. And then they start seeing because I'm holding them accountable. And then they're seeing the effects. And they're like, life is so much easier at home. Yeah, I'm like, yeah, because you're giving her your time and attention, which you want to. You're not doing it for her sake, you're doing it for your sake. And by doing that, everything else becomes easier.
It's almost like we don't believe that the little steps we can take will actually work. So putting a date night in or making a little bit more time in your calendar, we almost believe that those things are just, you said it earlier with meditation, and not doing that. People just feel like that's just 10 minutes wasted rather than it actually having a profound impact. Maybe a question here for you is, are there any practices that you recommend when you find someone who is in bad shape and really needs your help? Do you recommend any little, not hacks, but really transformations of habits to get out of that position?
It's a long list, Tom, and I want to answer it by going back to what you asked me about how I do this. The first thing we need to do is we need to get a handle on ourselves, right? So, am I good with myself in the way that I'm living my life? And that starts with the basics, which is sleep, food, exercise, relationships. Am I good on all those? No, I go to bed too late. I get up too early. I'm awake at night. Okay, how do we fix that? We fix that by, and then I have a long list of I get people to do. The same thing on the food, exercise, and the relationship. So once we've fixed that, that's a series of hacks, if you will, series of habits. I mentioned the weekly date night. I prescribe that to all my partnered clients, and they all do it, and they all see the effect. The reason they haven't done it themselves is because I don't know what to suggest we do. Then I give them a list of things they can do. Or it's busy. We don't have money for a babysitter, for example, right? Like, okay, well, then let's plan a date night after the kids go to bed. Or let's plan a date night during the weekend where you bring a picnic basket to the playground and you do your little date there. And so there is no one thing that will solve all this. But if you force me to pick one thing, I would say the first thing you should do is to find time for yourself without any devices. So most founder CEOs are always on their device, always with other people, and they feel guilty in both scenarios. So I suggest to them, or I tell them to find 30 minutes every single day where you are alone just with your thoughts. No devices, no screens, no people, no sounds, no nothing. I have one client, I said, you're going to show up at a half an hour earlier than your normal start time in your office, and you're going to sit on a bench by the lake that's by his office. He thought I was out of my mind. He's like, how am I going to do that? I'm too busy. I'm like, you're not too busy. You're going to do that. Well, I can't get up half an hour early. I mean, I'm going to bed at 2 o'clock in the morning as it is. You're going to go to bed at the latest midnight. How am I going to do that? So it kind of trickles down just by focusing on that 30 minutes. When people start doing that, Tom, in the beginning, they're like, That was awful. I had all these thoughts. I couldn't write them down. I thought about all this other stuff I needed to do. I'm like, I understand. Try it again tomorrow. And then they do the next day. And after they've done it a couple of days, they're like, holy cannoli, I actually enjoy sitting here. And I said, I can give them exercises of, watching trees or ducks or whatever, and give them a meditation. I also record audio for them that they can listen to when I allow that to happen after a few days. And by doing that, your system starts to relax. Your mind starts to relax. So they're essentially meditating without knowing that they're meditating. And then I'm like, all right, so now that you understand how this works, next time you're standing in line in the supermarket, I want you to feel your feet on the ground. Or the next time you're driving, I want you to notice the numbers on the license plate on all the cars in front of you. And I give them these small little things. And then little by little, all that mind chatter starts to dissipate. And then there's room for us to say, okay, now we can make decisions because we're not reacting or responding. We're actually reflecting. We're actually starting to think about what is it that I want to do here? And then you start making better decisions for yourself and for your business. And then you get out of that rut.
Do you find that you have to still watch yourself in the same way, or does this become so second nature after a while that you've learned almost how to naturally, or do you have to push yourself also to have a half hour sometimes?
Definitely have to keep myself on track. I'm a recovering addict, essentially, of work, right? So as all addictions, we have to make sure that we maintain good habits. I end up in situations where I have too much on my plate, or I lie awake worrying at night about stuff. The difference between me today and me 5 years ago is I now have the toolkit to fix it. And so that's primarily also what I do with clients. I give them a set of tools and show them how to use those tools to get out of the situations when they happen, because they will happen and they continue also to happen for me.
I want to ask you a slight detour, but I want to ask you about artificial intelligence and how it's changing how people now behave, right? Because now, in theory, you should be able to have smaller teams, or at least be able to change how people operate, but that obviously requires more devices and so on. What's your take on what this should mean for CEOs, and how would you almost advise your clients to be using AI alongside what you typically coach them on?
Oh, that's a giant question. I think what AI allows us to do is to move things quicker, whether it's explorational ideas or executional ideas or whatever it is. So as a CEO, I would use AI to be my partner in my discussions about different topics. So that's on sort of how to leverage the technology. I do find that people forget the human aspect a little bit when they use AI. So they treat AI as human, but it's not. And so what AI cannot do, it cannot teach you or help you become more empathetic or be more understanding of another person's situation. And so people think they can, because they can sit and have a chat saying, hey, I would like to be more empathetic. I have this challenge with this employee. I want to do this, that, and the other. And then it can give you suggestions. But to get from that to then actually doing it is a giant step, where the interaction that they can have with somebody like me still isn't there in AI. Having said that, it's been suggested, and I have built it, that I make a GPT of me, of what I do with all my writings and all my stuff.
Maybe I should
And
do that after this call.
yeah, and actually I use it on a daily basis because I write so much. So I'm like, hey, I want to write about this. What have I said about that before? And can you help me find a new angle on it? So that's helpful. But I'm pretty sure that if you asked my clients today, how valuable would it be to have Peter in your pocket? They would say it's valuable. So, as GPT, right? But what matters is the fact that I can look him in the eyes and that I can feel him and see him as I'm telling him my challenges. And I don't think AI is going to get to that point anytime soon.
I completely agree with that point you were making, that it's almost the transition from the advice into execution, and that transition that people struggle to make. So you might know the right thing to do, but you don't do it for whatever reason, or your balance is off. And I guess that's where the coaching part is so important, is to identify where exactly the problem is and where you're misaligned in the way that you described.
Can I use can I share an analogy here? It's kind of like the gym, right? I mean, Tom, you look like a healthy, fit guy,
Thank you.
so you probably go to the gym. You probably know how to do the exercises that you're doing in the gym, but I guarantee you, you don't do them as often enough and as well enough as if you had a personal trainer with you who said, Tom, come on down to the gym. I'm going to show you how to do, and I'm illustrating here, like this exercise so that you get that muscle that is causing you to either get bigger arms, if that's what you want to do, or strengthen your back or whatever it is. So the very personal one-on-one interaction that you can have with somebody like me, you still cannot have with technology. Technology will give you the surface answers and go very deep. It's very impressive what the technology can do. Absolutely. I use it every day for all sorts of things, but it can't get you down to that pinpoint, and it can't get you to the sense of the situation because that doesn't know your mind state. It doesn't know the context of your family. It doesn't know all these things about you. And I do, and therefore I can give different pieces of advice.
I'm curious. I don't know why this question's in my mind, but now that you now that you know what you know, you have this toolkit. You've helped so many other CEOs. If someone came to you tomorrow and said to you, "There's an exciting startup that we want you to lead, and you're the exact right person for it. Everything you speak about is the way we want to run it," would you consider it?
No, it happens not infrequently that somebody asks me that question, and I appreciate that, and I'm thankful for those opportunities. I'm done running companies and building businesses. I'd rather build humans, essentially. I'd rather help build somebody up than doing that, because I think I have a 13-year-old son, and some years ago, I changed from one business to another and said, I don't, I want my son to be able to point to his dad and say, my dad helped hundreds, if not thousands of people. He didn't just spend his life selling sugar water, because I was working for Coca-Cola at the time as a thing, right? So nothing bad with Coke. They can do what they want to do. But my point was, I'm thinking more about what is my legacy going to be now that I've been a dad for a number of years. And so it's more important for me to affect the lives of tens of thousands of people through my coaching of their leaders than it is to build this start on the other app or work on the environment or whatever it might be. I think I can have a bigger impact on the world doing what I do today than anything else. And that's why I'm answering this.
Um, and that maybe leads me to a final question, which is, what is when are you successful with your clients? When have you arrived? You say normally it takes about 6 weeks, but essentially what I'm asking is, what makes a successful whole human CEO in your mind?
Somebody who goes out into the world and lives their values, right? So back to if you can be a successful whole human CEO and work 80 hours a week, but if you're happy, healthy, if your relationships are working, go do that, right? You're living your values, and you're sleeping well at night, essentially. Um, I think I see it with them. I see it when there is sparkle in their eyes again. I see it when they come on a call and they actually smile. I see it when they tell me of the impact that the changes we've made together has on their team. I sometimes get to, so if I work with the founder CEO, I sometimes get to work with the COO or their executive team because we think that that will help the overall situation. And so I know I'm a success when somebody on the team says, he's changed. I can feel he's a different person now in the office. Or when I'm sometimes also speaking to the spouses of my clients, when the spouse literally says on a call, I don't know what you did, but my husband is a completely different man, right? And now I'm tearing up again. I'm a little bit of a softie, but that's what I know when I succeeded. It's when somebody, I get reports or I see that there's a change in their behavior.
Has that happened for you? You've changed since your UBS days, do you think?
Absolutely. I am a much calmer, uh, happier, considerate human being than I have ever been. I typically say that I'm in the best mental and physical shape of my life, and I'm 51, right? Um, I tell my girlfriend this frequently. I'm like, you would not have wanted to be near me 10 years ago. I am a completely different animal than I was back then. And I'm so happy that I got here. And I don't regret that I didn't get here as a 25-year-old because I don't think I could. But I'm just really happy that I'm here at this present moment like this.
Amazing. Um, Peter, I've really enjoyed this discussion. I feel like you've opened a world for me in understanding not only, honestly, sometimes as a business owner, you're just really focused about the next year and how you can grow. And you've reminded me of the importance of how you get there and why you're getting there. And I've really enjoyed this discussion to go back to values and what drives you, why you started out in the first place, and what it is you hope to achieve of life. And apologies for this monologue, but the partly why I say that is because I think we set goals sometimes where it's just short-term gains, but we forget about the overall trajectory of our lives, what it is that we want to achieve. And something along the way, when you were talking about people just don't figure out the date night, or they just don't figure out how they're going to work that into their schedules, it's almost like we just don't plan or design the lives that we should live. And you've reminded me of how important that is in this conversation. So I want to thank you for that. And I thank you for coming on to this. Is there any maybe final words you wanted to say to anyone who's listening to this, or any advice you would want to give them?
If you're not sleeping well at night, if you feel like you're short with people, if you're sacrificing time alone, exercise, friendships for the business, you need to stop. You need to think about what you're doing, how you're doing it. And if you think there's no other way, I'm here to tell you that there is. With me or with somebody else, talk to somebody and figure out to change your situation because it's not worth it.
Peter, thank you so much for joining. I've really enjoyed that discussion. I look forward to staying in touch and hopefully catching you in Copenhagen in the next few months. But it's been a pleasure, and I look forward to speaking to you soon.
Thanks for having me, Tom. It was a lot of fun. Thank you.